Imagine the marble of the Vatican glowing cold beneath wavering candlelight, every polished surface reflecting 1,000 tiny flames, and in that gleam, a scene designed to be unforgettable and unmentionable. Picture a hall crowded not with dignified blessing, but with a performance of humiliation. Women forced to crawl across stone to collect scattered chestnuts, while princes and prelates watch. What really happened that night? And why would a pope's household turn a wedding into an instrument of power? This is not a tale of mythic monsters in the dark. It is the story of a family at the height of its reach, of rites rehearsed to teach obedience, of witnesses who put ink to paper in the days that followed and tried, in their different ways, to make sense of what they had seen. At the center are familiar names: Lucrezia Borgia, a bride in a dynastic bargain; Alfonso d'Este, her husband in name and political shield; Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, the head of a family empire whose moral authority the world would soon challenge; and Cesare Borgia, the son whose muscle enforced the family's will. The chronicler who gives us our clearest window is Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, whose diary entries survive as a raw, often clinical record of rituals, gossip, and scandal. Other voices, diplomatic dispatches, later polemical tracts, and historians' reconstructions fill in contours and contradictions. Before we go further, a brief content warning. This account includes descriptions of ritualized humiliation and forced sexual acts reported by contemporary witnesses. I will avoid graphic detail and treat survivors with dignity, but if such material is distressing, take a moment before continuing. Italy, at the turn of the 16th century, was a map of family dynasties and mercenary power, where marriages were contracts of alliance and reputations were currency. The papacy had become, in practice as often as in theory, an instrument of family strategy for the Borgias. Rodrigo Borgia, occupying the chair of St. Peter as Alexander VI, used the papal office to secure lands, titles, and advantageous marriages for his relatives. Cesare Borgia, ambitious, ruthless, and the family's sword, moved to translate papal sanction into territorial control. Lucrezia, married several times in an era when noble women were political instruments, was swept into these arrangements. Her union with Alfonso d'Este was, like others in her life, less a romance than a transfer of political leverage. It is in this pressure chamber of dynastic calculation that the night in question is said to have occurred. A wedding intended not merely to join two houses, but to send a message. That power could stage actors, punish dissidents, and humiliate opponents with official imprimatur. The central scene has 3 parts, 3 acts, each of them a ritual of subjugation and spectacle, and together they crystallized a perception of the Roman court that would echo far beyond Italy's borders. In this first installment, we will delve into the first act in depth, set the political context that made it possible, and show how witnesses recorded the scene. We will stop before the night's full escalation, because its later moments demand careful source-by-source scrutiny. If you value digging up hidden history, subscribe. And if anything here tugs at you, leave a comment naming which act unsettles you most. Now, step closer. We begin with Act 1. Act 1. The Chestnut Banquet. The phrase chestnut banquet comes to us from later retellings and diplomatic gossip. Contemporary accounts are less tidy, but no less damning. The core claim runs like this. On the night of a Borgia-arranged wedding, frequently associated in rumor with Lucrezia's marriage to Alfonso d'Este, dozens of women described in sources as courtesans or prostitutes were gathered and presented before the assembled guests. At a sign from those in power, the women were ordered to crawl across the marble floor to pick up a pile of chestnuts scattered before them. The spectacle was designed to turn sex workers into instruments of humiliation. Their forced subjugation was to be a lesson for the wedding guests, and by extension, for any who might challenge Borgia authority. Reconstructing that image is a matter of assembling blunt fragments. Johann Burchard, who kept a day-by-day record of papal ceremonies and events, notes an unusual and embarrassing incident connected to Lucrezia's wedding. His entries are terse, often procedural, but when they betray emotion, the language is telling. Accusations of public disorder, of women brought into the papal court under shameful circumstances, and of guests stunned into silence. Borgia's notes do not always read like a court chronicler's glowing encomium. They are the work of an official clerk who recorded the rituals and the scandals when they occurred. Where Borgia is precise, names, dates, rooms, historians lean on him. Where he is fragmentary, rumor and dispatches rush to fill the gaps. If the chestnut image is the most enduring emblem, we should be cautious about the details. Many later retellings give a neat number, 50 courtesans. But the primary sources do not all agree, and the figure of 50 likely emerged from a mix of eyewitness approximation, polemical exaggeration, and the appetite of rumor. Some diplomatic letters mention a number of women without counting precisely. Others describe a small band of courtesans paraded for the guests. The staging, whether chestnuts were literally scattered, or whether that was a colorful metaphor for a public display of degradation, also varies between accounts. What is consistent, however, is the intent, to demonstrate the Pope's household's ability to orchestrate vulnerability for spectacle. To understand why such a scene would be arranged, look at the political logic. By dressing up humiliation as theater, the Borgia household converted private dominance into public pedagogy. A wedding ceremony could be more than the exchange of vows. It could be a demonstration of who controlled bodies, honors, and the very meaning of marriage in their sphere. Humiliation, when performed in front of nobles, cardinals, and foreign envoys, becomes a warning. Accept the new order or face public abasement. Imagine the hall itself. A long chamber off the Vatican courts, torches sputtering in brackets, the air heavy with the smell of tallow, spices, and the faint metallic tang of so many people moving in close quarters. Benches were filled with cardinals in rich red, ambassadors wrapped in foreign furs, local nobles trying to balance curiosity and decorum. At one end, a small stage or a raised dais held the couple. Around them, the innermost circle of power. Then, at a signal, women, many described as courtesans in contemporary reports, were brought in and ordered, humiliatingly, to the marble floor. What did witnesses see? Some report astonishment and shame. A number of cardinals are said to have crossed themselves, perhaps in private dismay. Others, unsure where to fix their gaze, looked away. Vernacular dispatches from foreign envoys, Venetian letters for instance, spread the tale back to courts abroad, often with an incredulous flourish. The Venetian diplomatic machine was notably attentive to moral scandal in Rome, because such stories could be weaponized in geopolitics, to discredit a pope, to justify anti-papal maneuvering, or to inflame opinion at home. Read against the grain, the chestnut ceremony also reveals the mechanics of Borgia's world. The master of ceremonies served as both observer and participant. He organized rituals, kept track of who sat where, recorded breaches of protocol. When he marked an incident as a breach, it meant the event stepped over the thin, often negotiated lines of acceptable papal practice. That is not the same as a modern moral judgment. It is a note that the spectacle moved into a category of public impropriety that threatened to harm the office's standing. Borgia's discomfort is not simply prurient, it is institutional. At the heart of the chestnut story lies an important ambiguity that we must hold tightly. Were the women summoned as part of a premeditated script, or were they the victims of a last-minute cruel prank engineered by men who saw in ritual an instrument of power? The difference matters. If staged, it implies a calculated display of domination. If spontaneous, it suggests a court culture where cruelty was possible without formal sanction. The available sources tilt towards staging, the category of presentation, the timing at the height of the feast, and the participation of trusted household officials point to deliberation. But because witnesses wrote after the fact, and because court chroniclers sometimes conflated or amplified episodes, historians classify some of the more lurid specifics as disputed. The chestnut banqueting incident injured reputations in two directions. For the people forced to crawl, the spectacle was an act of bodily humiliation that would be recorded in the administrative memory of the court. For the family of the bride, the event became a sign that their honor was at stake, and that the most intimate aspects of a woman's life, her body, her chastity, her public image, could be manipulated in the service of political theater. Lucrezia herself, whose historical portrayal has been alternately demonized and victimized by later storytellers, occupies the most painful center of this tension. Whether she sanctioned such theatrics, whether she was powerless to stop them, or whether she was used as a symbol in a cruel demonstration, her agency is difficult to reconstruct and often overshadowed by male actors' ambitions. After the spectacle, the immediate reactions were not uniform. Borgia records a mixture of stunned silence and private condemnation. He notes that the event left a bad impression among many in Rome. Other witnesses who sent reports to their sovereigns fill their dispatches with outrage. A Venetian envoy, writing back to his state, treated the incident as more than gossip. He framed it as evidence of moral decline at the papal court and as a sign that the Pope's house no longer kept the decorum expected of Rome's first magistracy. Such diplomatic letters would be read in chancelleries across Europe and would not remain contained in the hall's shadow. Yet here again, caution is required. The diplomatic lamentations sometimes carried the chancellery's own agendas. A state that disliked a strong pontiff might amplify scandal to reduce his influence or to justify resistance. Polemicists who wanted to undermine papal authority would have every incentive to circulate and embellish scandalous detail. Therefore, when a dispatch says 50 women, or asserts a ritual's exact phrasing, historians treat those numbers and speeches as reported commentaries rather than incontrovertible facts. Having described the scene and the likely motives, we must account for the archival trail. Borgia's diary remains the center of gravity. His entries provide a timeline and a formal record of breaches. Diplomatic correspondence, Venetian ambassadors' letters, reports from other courts, adds texture. These documents reflect not only what happened, but how the event was interpreted and used abroad. Later pamphlets and polemical tracts, written after the scandal took on mythic dimensions, complicate matters. They repeat, enlarge, and sometimes invent details that cannot be corroborated by contemporary records. That pattern, contemporary record, diplomatic reaction, then later amplification, is common in early modern scandal. Source note. Act 1. Primary evidence for the Chestnut episode rests on Johann Borgia's diary entries, Master of Ceremonies 1502-1503 entries under the wedding period, and on diplomatic letters from Venetian and other envoys sent to their home governments shortly after the event. Many later retellings supply numerical specifics, e.g., of 50 courtesans, and theatrical details. Those particulars are contested and often stem from subsequent polemical or propagandistic accounts rather than contemporaneous administrative records. Where sources disagree, this script uses reported or contested rather than asserting a single definitive version. What the Chestnut spectacle accomplished was not merely to humiliate a group of women, it was to ritualize humiliation in a way that made spectators into witnesses and hence into carriers of the story. By staging the degradation in the presence of cardinals and foreign envoys, the papal household ensured that the moment could not be entirely contained. Ink and rumor would carry the image outward. The Roman court's attempt at theatrical control paradoxically created the raw material for scandal. Inside that hall, faces told their own stories. Some guests feigned indifference, others registered private horror. The poets and polemicists would later cast the moment as emblematic of a church in decay, but contemporary reactions were mixed complex, and politically freighted. For some, the event was a grotesque but local breach of etiquette. For others, it was evidence that the papacy's moral authority was compromised in ways that had immediate political ramifications. Lucrezia's own response is hardest to locate cleanly in the record. She appears in administrative notes as the bride, as an object of alliance, and as the woman whose marriage consolidated a significant territorial connection for the Borgias. Yet personal testimony, her voice, is absent or filtered through the pens of clerks and envoys. This absence makes her both a symbol and a silenced presence. Historians therefore proceed cautiously. Some depict her primarily as a victim, others as a politically active figure who navigated a treacherous court. Most agree that any simple binary fails to capture the lived complexity of her situation. Even as rumors of the chestnut banquet spread, the household moved to contain damage. Orders may have been issued. Some sources suggest an attempt to seal certain records or discourage public discussion. But where secrecy meets rumor, containment is rarely absolute. Diplomatic dispatches betray what went wrong for the papal image. In the corridors of Europe's courts, scandal traveled faster than silence. For those outside Rome, the chestnut story fit into existing anxieties about clerical vice and the secularization of spiritual office. The chestnut scene, therefore, served a dual function. In the moment, it asserted dominance and theatricalized humiliation. Afterward, it became a talisman for critics of the Borgia household and of papal excess. That talisman would later be wielded by voices across the political spectrum, from rival Italian potentates to reformers in Germany, each repurposing the image to fit their critiques. But the chestnut banquet, as shocking as it is, was only the opening move. Witnesses who saw the humiliation, and those who recorded it, also reported a second, darker escalation during that night. A public procedure intended to verify the wedding itself in a manner that, by contemporary standards, transgressed private bounds. It is here that the narrative grows more complex, the sources more myriad, and the ethical stakes higher. Some accounts speak of coercion and of a humiliating public verification of consummation. Others couch the matter in ritual and juridical terms, arguing that the ceremony served a legal purpose in confirming dynastic legitimacy. And that is where the story turns toward its most contested and troubling items, details that historians have debated for centuries, and that require us to weigh eyewitness candor against diplomatic hyperbole, to parse administrative prose for human suffering, and to separate what is probable from what was later amplified. The questions multiply. What exactly was meant to be proved in public? Who ordered the verification? Did witnesses understand the procedure as juridical validation or as a theatrical display of subjugation? Which elements of the story are corroborated by Burchard's notes, and which appear only in dispatches or posthumous polemics? The answers vary with the reader and the source. No single paper trail gives us everything. As the night pushed on and the initial spectacle settled into the memory of those who saw it, new behaviors emerged. Whispered instructions in corridors, the movement of guards to block exits, the shifting of furniture to create a private space suddenly made public. The mood hardened. What had been a grotesque jest for some became, for others, a show of force. This is where contemporary observers drew lines between misrule and malice, between a scandal and an institutional crime. We will follow those lines in detail in the next section. There, we will examine the reported public consummation, what eyewitnesses say they saw, how Burchard records it, or does not, and how diplomats use the story in their dispatches. We will pass the most disputed claims, most notably the repeated 3 times verification, and weigh them against the archival record. For now, reflect on Act 1's significance. A staged degradation that turned a private function into public pedagogy, and a first act whose echoes would travel far beyond the Vatican walls. Source note: Transition. The Chestnut banquet's main primary witness is Johann Burchard's ceremonial diary. Corroboration appears in contemporary diplomatic letters, especially Venetian dispatches. Numeric details and dramatic embellishments in later printed pamphlets are often treated as polemical exaggeration. Historians recommend cautious interpretation. Treat the core event, public humiliation of women at the wedding, as supported by multiple contemporary observers, while labeling specific counts and theatrical staging details as contested, unless attested in primary administrative records. The hall grew quiet after the chestnuts were gathered. The guests' murmurs diffused into the stone. Some tried to return to the business of the feast. Others carried the image with them, an image that, by design, would not stay locked inside the palace. Those who had seen the spectacle now faced a choice: speak and spread scandal, or keep silence and preserve their positions. Many did both. They wrote to their superiors with horror veiled in diplomatic language, and they closed palace doors with the knowledge that the moment would have to be accounted for. What followed that evening, according to contemporary reports, was a procedure that moved from theatrical humiliation into the realm of enforced private verification. To understand its implications, we must track the eyewitness statements, read Burchard's next entries with attention to what he omits as much as to what he includes, and examine the diplomatic ripples that began to spread through Italy and beyond. The second act of that night will demand even stricter source criticism, because there the allegations touch on sexual coercion and juridical symbolism, and because the stakes for reputations, ecclesiastical authority, and the future of the Borgia family could not have been higher. We will pick up the thread there, sorting report from rhetoric, weighing how much ritual and how much force shaped the next sequence of events, and following the trail that turned a wedding into a forensic and political spectacle. Act 2. The public consummation. After the chestnuts were gathered and the stone grew heavy with witness, the evening did not simply dissolve into embarrassed laughter or forgotten gossip. Contemporary accounts suggest that what followed moved from theatrical humiliation into a procedure that observers described in terms both juridical and coercive, a public verification of the marriage itself. The description that reaches us is fragmentary and fraught with contestation, but its outlines are brutally simple. The marriage, already a political contract, was to be made incontrovertible in the presence of witnesses, and that verification, according to several reports, involved the couple's sexual intercourse being witnessed or otherwise attested in a manner that many contemporaries found shocking. What is reported varies by source. Some dispatches and later polemical accounts insist that the consummation was ordered to be witnessed 3 times, a detail that circulated widely in rumor and printed pamphlets. Johann Burchard's diary, our most immediate administrative record, does not provide a neat script of the scene in lurid terms. He records breaches of ceremony, the presence of scandalous occurrences, and the reaction of courtly participants.
Where Burchard is precise, his tone is bureaucratic. Where he is silent, others fill the silence with interpretation. Venetian envoys, whose letters home were quick to moralize about Rome, described a forced display intended to prove that the bride was available in the legal sense, and that the marriage bond had been completed under the papal household's auspices.
Later, antiquarian narrators and Protestant polemicists turned these sketches into a more elaborate tale. Public beds, guarded doors, and repetition thrice over as a ritualized proof. We must be careful about what to treat as fact and what to mark as reported or contested. The claim that the consummation was performed publicly in the modern literal sense, open for all to watch, is not consistently attested in the administrative record. More credible is the interpretation that some form of verification was sought under pressure. Either the presence of a small number of witnesses, the testimony of attendants, or a dramatized performance intended to make clear beyond dispute that the marriage had been consummated. In a political culture where the legitimacy of heirs, dowries, and territorial claims could pivot on the assurance that a marriage had been completed, such verification had real stakes. What made this instance exceptional was the alleged theatricality and the coercive environment surrounding it. Why would the papal household, or those acting in its name, seek such a public confirmation? Political logic offers several non-exclusive explanations. First, marriage for the elite was legal currency. Until consummation was established, alliances could be challenged, dowries withheld, or claims contested. If rivals or skeptics threatened the contractual tie between the Borgia family and the d'Este house, an unmistakable signal of consummation would close legal loopholes. Second, the demonstration of physical control over the bride could be read, cynically, as a symbol. To show that the Borgia household could determine even the most intimate affairs of those under its political umbrella. Third, in the volatile environment of Italian courts, with spies, envoys, and rumor, making private proofs public could be an intimidation tactic aimed at domestic or foreign observers. Eyewitness language in the diplomatic corpus is revealing for what it chooses to emphasize. Venetian letters relay moral outrage and treat the episode as symptomatic of broader clerical decadence. Some ambassadors use the image as political ammunition. Their descriptions favor the most scandalous interpretations because scandal was currency in chancelleries. A damaged pontiff was a weaker political actor. Burchard, the formal recorder, leaves us a sparser trace. His diary notes procedural irregularities and the palpable distress of some guests. It emphasizes breaches of decorum more than forensic detail. That pattern, administrative reticence paired with diplomatic amplification, creates the space for the three-times story to flourish in later retellings. The figure of Cesare Borgia looms large in accounts of the night's escalation. Described by contemporaries and historians as the family's enforcer, Cesare's reputation for ruthlessness and theatrical displays of authority makes him an obvious candidate in readers' minds for the architect of humiliation. Some dispatches and later narratives imply his involvement in securing the physical conditions for the verification, ordering guards, ensuring privacy, or otherwise supervising the episode. But here, too, the sources divide. While Cesare's presence at the court and his readiness to use force are well attested, the documentary evidence that he personally ordered or directly supervised a public consummation is less direct than later accounts imply. Historians therefore generally frame Cesare's role as probable in motive. He had everything to gain from a ritual that consolidated allegiance, but uncertain in procedural fact. The extent of his direct orchestration is reported rather than definitively proven in the primary administrative files. Equally important is how contemporaries interpreted the action. For some observers, the procedure had a quasi-juridical face, a public attestation designed to foreclose contestation over the marriage's validity. For others, particularly moralizing envoys and later polemicists, the same act was almost purely theatrical, designed to humiliate, to display dominion, and to send a message that the Borgia household exercised sovereignty over bodies and reputations. Both readings can be true simultaneously. The act could serve a legal purpose while also functioning as political theater. The problem lies in the degree of coercion and the experience of those forced into the scene. Lucrezia's own agency is, again, difficult to gauge with confidence, and historians rightly treat reconstructions of her feelings or consent with caution. There is an additional dimension to consider. Ritual and public proof existed within a broader legal and cultural matrix. In some early modern contexts, proving consummation could involve testimony from servants or medical examinations, procedures that, by modern standards, are invasive but were part of contemporary juridical practice. What sets the Vatican night apart in the sources is the alleged scale and setting. A banquet turned into a quasi-forensic event in which the visibility and spectacle intensified the humiliation. Whether the threefold repetition was a literal insistence on multiple witnessed acts, a rhetorical flourish in dispatches, or a misremembered trope that later historians and polemicists attached to the event, remains contested. Where a diplomat uses 3 times as a figure of speech evoking thoroughness, later pamphleteers might convert it into a sensational fact. As evidence then, the public consummation episode depends on cross-referencing Burchard's procedural notes, the vivid but often polemical letters of envoys, Venetian and others, and later printed accounts that shaped the scandal's reception. Burchard again provides the administrative beats: a breach, gatherings, private movements within the palace. Envoys provide colour and moral judgment. Later writers amplify. Together they form a layered portrait, uneven, partial, and charged. Source note. Act 2, the core documentary trail for the public consummation, consists of Johann Burchard's ceremonial diary entries, noted for procedural detail but sparing in sensational description, and contemporary diplomatic correspondence, particularly Venetian dispatches that report scandal and moral censure. Many of the more dramatic specifics, public spectacle in the literal sense, the threefold repetition as a verified ritual, are attested mainly in later polemical tracts and printed narratives. Historians warn that the 3 times formulation is contested. It appears in some contemporary letters as reported claim and is amplified in post-contemporary accounts. Treat it as reported rather than incontrovertible. Act 2 ends in a different silence from the one that followed the Chestnuts. This was the kind of silence that registers not merely embarrassment, but moral rupture. The room's polite noises shut down under the weight of something that the law, the church, and social norms did not easily know how to categorize. Some guests wrote, others looked away. A few, according to dispatches, whispered of outrage and blasphemy. The seed of scandal, nourished by protocol breaches and diplomatic gossip, began to germinate beyond the palace walls. Act 3. Aftermath and echoes. Scandal in early modern Europe was not contained in the moment. It migrated through chancelleries, barbershops, and printing presses. In the weeks and months after that night, the Vatican's corridors filled with both quieter efforts at containment and louder waves of reproach. Orders may have been issued in varying degrees to keep official records tighter, to prevent the circulation of damaging papers, and to quiet public conversation. But secrecy rarely wins against the momentum of rumor and the strategic uses to which scandal could be put. Immediate diplomatic fallout is the clearest trace. Ambassadors abroad, Venetian, Spanish, and others, penned notes that converted the evening into evidence. They framed the episode as symptomatic of Roman excess and used it to argue against papal policies or to bolster their own sovereign stances. A chancery's report, after all, is rarely just record. It is argument. Political opponents seized the moment as a weapon. For those who wish to limit papal influence in Italian politics or to bolster rival houses, the image of a pope's household staging humiliation, whether the exact mechanics were as lurid as later pamphlets claimed or not, proved politically valuable. Beyond chancelleries, the story fed a growing literature of complaint and rumor that critics of clerical corruption would later seize upon. In the decades to come, reforming voices in Germany and beyond would marshal examples from Rome as proof of systemic metastases in the Church's governance. Martin Luther and other reformers did not cite the Vatican's private scandals as singular causes of the Reformation. But events like the Borgia household's excesses were woven into a larger tapestry of grievances, simultaneously anecdotal and emblematic. In Protestant polemics, the Chestnut spectacle and the alleged public consummation were potent symbols of everything perceived to be wrong with a papacy that mixed spiritual office and dynastic ambition. On the domestic front, the reputational damage to the Borgias was complex and cumulative. Rodrigo Borgia's papal authority, already questioned by political rivals, now bore the additional burden of scandal made public. Cesare Borgia's attempts to consolidate territorial power were not immediately undone by gossip. Yet the family's political legitimacy suffered in reputational terms. The court's capacity to intimidate and enchant had been exposed as a cause for both fear and disdain. In some quarters, allies recalculated their positions. In others, opportunists opened negotiations. The material consequences, shifts in alliance, diplomatic hesitations, and reconfigured bargaining, are harder to map precisely, but clear in contemporaneous correspondence. For the individuals most visibly implicated, the aftershocks were also human and private. Lucrezia's life afterward is a study in constrained mobility and cautious rehabilitation. Married into the Este family, she would eventually be repositioned in Ferrara where, by many accounts, she achieved a measure of stability and patronage that later chroniclers contrasted with the earlier Roman tumult. That contrast is instructive. Lucrezia's later role as a duchess and cultural patron complicates any simple narrative of her as either an unambiguous victim or an unscrupulous actor. Her public image was contested with equal vigor by supporters and attackers, and her private experience, her trauma, her endurance, her alliances, escapes precise reconstruction because the archive that would reveal inner life is thin. Alfonso d'Este's reputation and position also bore the mark of association. For him, the marriage was a political transaction that brought immediate benefits in terms of alliance. However, the humiliation surrounding its public aspects complicated his reception at other courts, and perhaps his private standing. Whether Alfonso considered the verification procedure necessary for legal reasons, or whether he felt manipulated by the pageantry forced upon him and his bride, is not plainly recorded in ways that allow definite judgment. Most historians therefore treat his role as ambivalent. A political actor enmeshed in a system of mutual benefit and coercion. Longer-term political consequences for the Borgia household unfolded with dramatic rapidity in the years that followed. Rodrigo Borgia's hold on papal power weakened. His death, occurring within a short span after a cascade of crises, set off immediate contests for control. Cesare, deprived of the protective authority of his father, found his political project increasingly precarious. Alliances loosened, enemies capitalized, and the family's territorial ambitions faltered. Whether the scandal of the wedding night was the decisive cause of the Borgia decline is unlikely. Dynastic fortunes ebb and flow for myriad reasons. But the episode contributed to an atmosphere of suspicion and moral condemnation that made rivals less inclined to defer and allies more willing to betray. Cultural legacy and the politics of memory are as important as immediate cause and effect. Scandals stick to reputations and then to institutional narratives. The Chestnut banquet and the reports of public verification became data points in a growing corpus used by critics of Rome. Print culture exacerbated this. The advent of widely circulated pamphlets and chronicles meant that a rumor produced in a banquet hall could, within years, become a common exemplar of papal corruption across borders. That process, the conversion of local scandal into transnational symbol, helped shape popular and elite perceptions of the papacy and fed narratives that undergirded later critiques. Historiography reflects this layered afterlife. Earlier historians, writing in eras more removed and sometimes more polemically inclined, often accepted the most sensational versions of the tale and used them to anchor moral judgments. Modern scholarship tends toward greater source caution. It places Burchard and diplomatic letters at the center, treats later pamphlets as amplification, and avoids asserting lurid details that cannot be corroborated. This does not exculpate the actors involved. Rather, it reframes the scandal as both real and instrumentally used by political actors with competing agendas. Source note: Act 3. The aftermath is documented most clearly in diplomatic correspondence, Venetian dispatches being particularly vocal, and in administrative traces indicating attempts to manage reputational damage. The long-term reception of the episode, including its use by reformers, appears in polemical literature of the following decades, and in reformist tracts that employed Roman scandals to criticize clerical excess. Modern historical treatments emphasize Burchard's diary as the baseline administrative source, contemporaneous envoys for immediate reaction, and later pamphlets and polemics as interpretive and amplificatory layers. Where sources conflict, this script marks sensationalized retellings as contested. Climax, the political and moral consequence. If we ask what the night's 3 acts together accomplished, the answer is not a single event, but a shift in how the papal household was seen, both at home and abroad. The Chestnut banquet staged humiliation. The alleged public verification attached juridical force to that humiliation. The aftermath translated private shame into public fodder for political and religious critics. Together, they crystallized an image of a papal court where familial ambition and ceremonial power commingled in ways that undermined moral authority. The moral weight is not an abstract indictment of an institution, but a record of human cost. The women who crawled, the bride whose private life became a spectacle, the courtiers whose silence was bought with position, all of them were subjects in a drama whose authorship sits uneasily across sources. Power, in this case, used ritual to assert sovereignty over bodies. Its effect was to reduce persons to symbols. That reduction mattered both for the people involved and for the politics of legitimacy in Italy and beyond. In a broader sense, the episode illustrates how spectacle functions as governance. By producing a visible demonstration of control, those in power sought to deter dissent and to signal dominance. Yet spectacle also produces witnesses, and witnesses produce records. The attempt to neutralize opposition through performance created the documentary residue that later critics, whether chancery officials or reformers, would exploit. In short, theatricalized humiliation can be an effective short-term tactic. In the long term, it risks producing the very evidence that will make rulers vulnerable. Denouement. Memory and responsibility. History settles into memory in complicated ways. For the Borgias, the marriage scandal became one of several charges that tourists of reputation would later point to as emblematic of papal excess. For Lucrezia and Alfonso, the record is more intimate and less neatly summarized. A marriage marked by power, survival, and eventual reconfiguration. For Cesare and Rodrigo, the scandal was one among a constellation of political moves that both elevated and imperiled them. What remains ethically urgent is the need to preserve the dignity of those who suffered while still interrogating the power structures that produced the suffering. Our sources, Burchard's diary, diplomatic dispatches, and later tracts, tell us less about inner motive than about observable acts and the interpretations they invited. The historian's task is to name what is attested, mark what is contested, and avoid folding conjecture into fact. Editorial corrections and source transparency. In reading many retellings of this night, historians encounter corruptions and misprints. Rodrigo Borgia is sometimes misnamed in later transcripts, and Cesare's name appears in varied spellings. The master of ceremonies' name appears as Johann or Johann Burchard, and careful work restores these to their historically accepted forms. Where a claim rests solely on a later 17th or 18th century pamphlet, it should be flagged as coming from a polemical tradition rather than from a contemporaneous account. Where multiple diplomatic dispatches converge on a particular complaint, the claim gains credibility. In practice, this means treating the Chestnut humiliation as a well-attested event in the immediate record, treating the public verification as reported and variably attested, and treating later numeric or theatrical specifics, such as precise counts of 50 courtesans, or a literal stage bed visible to all present, as contested amplifications unless supported by primary administrative notes. Final reflection. Power leaves traces, some deliberate, some accidental. That night inside the Vatican produced both. Performances intended to mark dominion, and records that preserved the reaction. We are left with three interlocking acts: the chestnut banquet that staged degradation, the alleged public consummation that blurred juridical proof and coercion, and the aftermath that turned a private humiliation into public fuel for political and religious critique. Each act is instructive on its own. Taken together, they form a cautionary tale about how the tools of authority, ritual, law, and spectacle can be repurposed into instruments of domination. Which of these acts unsettles you most? The theatrical humiliation that made witnesses complicit? The invasion of the most private sphere in the name of legal certainty? Or the way scandal became currency, used by rival powers and reformers alike to wound an institution? Tell us in the comments which of the three acts lingers for you, and if this account moved you to look deeper, seek out the primary sources: Johann Burchard's diary entries, contemporary Venetian dispatches, and cautious modern histories that separate archival fact from later fiction. Source summary and recommended reading. Primary sources to consult: Johann Burchard's ceremonial diary, entries around the wedding period, and diplomatic letters from Venetian and other envoys that report scandal and reaction. Secondary scholarship that treats the episode with source-critical care will note where pamphlets and polemical accounts expand upon the contemporary record. Where names appear mangled in older retellings, authoritative editions correct them. Rodrigo Borgia is properly Alexander VI. Cesare Borgia is the son often implicated in enforcement. Johann Burchard is the master of ceremonies whose diary anchors much of our chronology. A closing note on tone. This account aims neither to sensationalize nor to exonerate, but to reconstruct, as faithfully as the archive allows, a night of ritual and power whose echoes shaped reputations and resonated in the political conflicts that followed. The past leaves us imperfect records. The responsibility of the present is to read them carefully, to mark uncertainty where it exists, and to hold the dignity of the affected persons at the center of our retelling. If you found this investigation revealing, consider sharing it with someone interested in how private performances of power become public history. And again, tell us in the comments which of the three shocking acts revealed at the Vatican troubled you most.